All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. I hope you all have been having a great day. Oh, okay. Oh, now I see. I'm sorry. I was looking at my own slides and I was like, where is like the bottom part? So sure enough, I did put a funny disclaimer in here. I actually decided to theme this whole talk using Black Widow since we're in the Black Widow room. So for legal reasons, hey, this has nothing to do with Marvel. I'm not Marvel and all that great stuff, right? But yeah, so welcome. I want to talk about, and bring you on a mission of how to have more clarity, with decisions that are made, as far as architecture. This is, imagine Black Widow going through this labyrinth, right, and trying to figure out which corners to take, what corners to not take, where are the traps, where are not the traps. And without thinking through and getting that documentation, it's really hard to figure that out. There's some challenges we have to make. Think about this, you get lost in that labyrinth. We go through, we might stint into a new project or project's been around for a while, and we don't know why decisions were made. And the hard part, that could be a decision you made last week. Why did you even make that decision? But more importantly, why did decisions get made a long time ago? Throughout my career, plenty of times I've joined companies where I'm taking over projects that have been around for a long time. And what I'll hear is, yeah, the previous team, they did this thing, and it's so wrong, we just need to redo it. And what I always say is, we need to figure out why they did that, because there's probably a reason why they chose this way or not that way. And that's, how do we figure that out? Another thing is, the fact of, getting the team aligned and figuring out what we need to do. How can we do that? And that's where ADRs can come to help. Help us really figure this out. Help reduce, frictions and delays, because we keep on rediscussing, decisions that were made that we can't really remember what all we decided. And also, just the ghost of decisions past, right? The hard part is we make a decision and then we forget about it. And then, long time afterwards, it comes to haunt us. A great example, so in 2012, Knight Capital Group, they had a disastrous day. In one day, they lost $440 million. Actually, it wasn't even one day, it was in 45 minutes. And it was all because they made a deployment, and there was a switch in there. They didn't realize what that flag meant. And they obviously chose the wrong option for that flag. And this was automated trading. And so all of a sudden, 45 minutes later, that company was down $440 million. And these are the kind of things, we have to think about. And because they didn't know what that thing meant, it must mean this. So lots of challenges, that we have to go through. How do we handle those? And that's where ADRs, kind of our hero. How can we have a way to know these? What can we do to do these things? And that's what architectural decision records are. They are basically leaving that trail of breadcrumbs, giving us the path of why we did something. And it's not just hey, we made this decision. It's also things like, why did we make that decision? What other things did we consider? And these are some of the things that we look in here. It also gives us that one team, one mission, right? It ensures that the team's aligned. ADRs, especially for the architects, in the rooms, I always have to remember we're multiple rooms, but, for the architects, you can't be that ivory tower, right? And ADRs are a great tool because you can write these up, but then get feedback from the rest of the team. Make sure that, we're all aligned in what we're deciding. And it gives us that compass, right? Learning how to move forward, right? Especially with new things. In my job, I have the responsibility of writing these architectures and then handing it down to the dev teams, working with them. And this really helps them understand, especially, what I do a lot is I'll write architectural documents that are describing the architecture we're about to build, but then I have the decisions, right, that go alongside that. And it really helps, get that more vision as to why we decided to go one way or another. And then finally, the idea of learning from the past, right? Architectural decision records are great just in the fact of when we're in a project, but also learning from previous projects, right? When we take on that next project, and we'll say, oh, that's similar to this kind of thing, we could do these things, but then you forget all the things that were decided. And that's where architectural decision records can come into play. So lots of good reasons. And that's what we're going to be talking about, over the next 45 minutes. So the mission briefing or the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the origins and the intel, right? So what are architectural decision records and so forth. But then we're going to get into the real meat of everything, the tools and tactics, right? So I'm going to talk about templates, what makes up an ADR, and also more what you should put into these things. I've got my section called the war stories. Because it's only 45 minutes, I'm only going to talk about one example, but some examples of a realistic ADR. How can we dissect it and see how that was written up? And then finally, your mission, your call to action. So hopefully I've got you pumped up. You're excited. You want to learn about this. I mean, obviously you've decided to come here after lunch. Lots of great talks during this hour. But what are the origins? Well, if we think about this, so architectural decision records really aren't that old. There was a paper written in 2012 or 2011, sorry, and this guy, he came up with the idea, and I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, but he wrote up about decision records, and this is really the birth of this. And you think about before these days, right? And honestly, I got to admit, I didn't really see architectural records until about 10 years ago. And how did we deal with this? Well, the problem is we didn't deal with it very well. And that was the whole problem, right? And, so we were seeing this catalyst because as projects were getting more mainstream, I'm old enough, I was in the .com period and then the past periods, the periods that came after that, And, we kept on getting these projects and not remembering what happened. Like I said, I've joined a lot of projects that are midstream. For a long time, I had that distinction of picking up projects that were, failing and helping them get back. But again, my first question always was, well, why did you go down this path? And usually no one remembered. Half the time because the people who made those decisions were gone, right? The other half is, you'll see people, well, I think we made it this. Oh, no, it's because of this reason. And you would hear people conflicting to the reasons. They weren't even really sure as to why they made decisions. Or things like that flag I was talking about with that financial firm. They didn't even remember what that whole thing meant, and so they had no idea. So as software development got better and we got more mature, we get these things. Like I said, in 2011, there was an article written about this concept. And I won't say it took off like wildfire, right? Because, you still see a lot of organizations that have no idea what ADRs are. It's still, I wouldn't say a new idea, but it's still more of a novel idea in the sense that you just don't see it very often. But we are seeing this emergence because software is difficult. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made, and it's not easy. So this is, kind of that promise of change. Now because we have a way, we have a way to document this. And the great part is, architectural decision records are very open in the way how you do them, right? The key part is that you do them, the fact that you actually do record everything. But it's not like you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way. I'm going to talk about some best practices, right? Because there are definitely some best practices. But I'm sure there's other people here in the room who have been doing ADRs and will look at some of my practices and say, why are you doing it that way? I'm like, well, because this is what we have learned that works well for us. So, so if we think about, again, talking about that timeline, we saw that where we go from chaos, not really knowing what's going on. The decision-making process was disorganized. There really was no, documentation about this. But afterwards, we see a transformation. And here's a prime example. I'm currently working on an issue, at our company, and we are actually, we've already started writing the decision record. We don't know what the decision yet is. We already figured out what the options are, but there's still a lot of conversation that we need to do. But the great part is because I've already written that ADR, we have a way to track our discussions. Because sure enough, and I was going to talk about this in a little bit, but we actually put all our stuff in our Git repo. So we can have those discussions and they can be recorded alongside everything. So it works really well. This is a transformational journey. So hopefully, I get a lot of people that come, finish this talk and say, hey, I definitely want to do these. And what you'll find is you're not going to be perfect at them at first. These do take practice. It takes time to figure out the right way to do it. It takes time to figure out what exact options do you want to do with this, all right? And then tooling is still not the best when it comes to ADR, so you're figuring out what's the best way to actually implement your ADRs. But what you will find is that there's this value. You come up with a structured document of how to document your decisions, and you'll find real value out of that. I've now implemented ADRs in several different companies I've worked for, and every single place. At first it's like, oh, that sounds good, but we'll let the architects deal with that and no one else. But we kind of push them along and get the developers and the stakeholders involved with these also. And and again, people see that value. And the big thing is this empowers the teams. Again, especially when you have the dedicated architects who are writing these things, coming up with these types of decisions, it actually gives empowerment to the developers that are taking those architectures, because they can then see the decisions that went behind those architectures. And and I love it when I have a developer who will come up to me and say, "Hey, I was reading your ADR, and I think you picked the wrong thing." And I was like, "Well, great, let's talk, right?" But they at least know where I came from with that. So, I've been talking about these, but what are they? Well, the biggest thing is they're lightweight. Their documentation is lightweight. They're capturing important decisions. Now, I've given this talk a couple times, and the question I always get is, well, what decisions do we record and what decisions do we not record? Because I just said important decisions. And the answer is, it depends. Because it really does depend, right? What is an important decision in your fact, right? If you are a Microsoft shop that does Blazor applications, you don't need to write every single time you start a new project, oh, we're going to do Blazor. It's kind of obvious at that point, right? That's, at that point, you're just writing documentation for documentation purposes. But anything where you're going to do something either new or different, then that's where you really should be considering those. And especially the more impactful those decisions are, the more likely you should be writing those documentations. Because they are the blueprint to that decision, right? And that's what we want to think about. And finally, the big thing I want to talk about, is make sure you provide that transparency, right, and that accountability. Make sure we have a way to go back and, like I say, give everyone an opportunity to write these or to read these and figure out what you were thinking. The next thing, so why they're important. Well, one, like I say, they tell us why we made decisions. It's usually the biggest, thing we're missing when it comes to software design, is the whys. And unfortunately, it's not an unusual thing that we see. Well, and I don't want to say that this is what everyone's doing, but it gets to well, because I said so, right? Because I have experience and I know this is what we should do. No, you really do want to document that. Because I don't know about you, but I make decisions and I don't necessarily remember why I made that decision, right? I'll say, where I'm at, we're working on, 4 different microservice systems, right? That are 4 completely different systems. They are interconnecting with each other, but they're just different systems, and some of these are really large. And so the decision I made on architecture, weeks ago when I was prepping it so it was ready in the schedule, I'm not going to remember those kind of things. That's where they really do help us with that. But more importantly, those decisions we made, hey, we finished that project, and now we need to make an update to them. Why in the world did we do this? And that's where it helps us. Again, they're reducing that back and forth discussions. And not to say back and forth discussions are a bad thing, but if we all know where we're coming from, on a level set, that will help them out. And again, that promoting transparency and accountability. Sorry, I forgot that I put notes on each one of those points, but I'm just that's why I'm clicking to get to where I wanted to go. All right, so that's kind of the what ADRs are and such, but let's actually start seeing them and start seeing what makes up an ADR. And like I say, what makes up your ADRs is going to depend on what matters to you. But there are a couple things you definitely want in your ADR that you definitely will need. And the big thing is the decision, right? What was decided? And this should be very clear and very simple, right? Within, further information. This is the most important part of the whole document, is that decision. What did you decide to do? An example would be something like, we chose to use a NoSQL database for this service, right? That's very specific. It tells you exactly what we decided. And there should be a statement as simple as that. Now I'll talk a little bit more about clarity and vagueness, but the actual write-up of the decision should be very simple, so it's easy to understand and easily comprehended. The next big thing you want to include in here is context. What was the reason you needed to make this decision? This could be as simple as, well, we got a requirement from the stakeholders, or this could be because we ran into a problem, right? But describe that. Describe so that, again, when people are reading this later on, they understand how you came up to that problem. So I was mentioning, I just wrote up a new ADR just yesterday. I was actually writing the ADR. And this was a bonehead move, but the company has not done integration tests yet. And like I say, we're building microservices. Integration tests is going to be really, really important. And so we've been building this out, and honestly, no one thought about the problem that, we're using Azure DevOps, using the pipelines, and then all our services are in Azure, and they're all public access turned off and private endpoints, because obviously we don't want anyone getting into our systems. Well, guess what you can't do? You can't do an integration test from Azure DevOps, on the hosted build agents, and then reach out to a private endpoint. That won't work, right? So that's what I wrote up. Hey, we're going down this path. We can't do this in order to have the security that we want to do, right? So I describe the whole context. I describe the limitations, with the hosted apps, and again, it's not the end of the world. DevOps offers self-hosted, and that's what we're going to end up doing. But even with that, there's a couple options we need to make. And more importantly, this decision, the way how our company has done IT, is we have software development, and then we basically have IT. They're two different divisions. We're not one division. We work closely with each other and in the same office space. But multiple people need to make that decision, because obviously, I now need VMs to be stood up and obviously machines to be built. So that's what you see in a context. And the third main big thing, and again, you might have quite a bit more, but is the consequences. What are the trade-offs if we make this decision? But also, what are the good things? What do we foresee we're going to be able to see with this? And I also like adding in those neutrals, right? The things that, this isn't good, this isn't bad, but, there's things we need to think about, right? So, for example, talking about, the story I was just working on yesterday, a neutral is, well, we now need to manage, these VMs, and we need the licenses. That's not a negative on any of the options, but, that's one of the things we have to think about when we come to this. But again, make sure we have those bad things also. And what I will see is, when people are trying to justify why they picked one thing or another, usually when they're talking about the other decisions, they'll put really bad consequences on there. But be honest with them, right? I mean, that's something you want to make sure. All right. So what does an ADR look like? And even on the big screen, it's still a little bit small, but I am going to show these section by section. But this is the template I use. Now, I will tell you, a lot of people will tell you this is a heavy template, and sure enough, it is. But we decided to go with this template. It has quite a bit more information in here. And I will mention at the end of the deck, I have a QR code. I have this template. I have some examples all in my repo, so you can definitely grab all those. But, this is actually a newer template for me. I've been with my current company for just shy of a year and a half. And I built this with this company, right? So I actually added some things I didn't have before. But what do we have in here? Well, first off, I've got the title and metadata, right? So the title is really important. The title should be short because it should be easily identifiable, right? So you want to come up with that short title. But then I've got some metadata in here, right? So the status, the date, and then the work item. So the work item, what I do with those is I actually link to the Azure DevOps board, the item that actually drove this, whether it's either an item that told us to write up the decision record or the item that caused us to need to make a decision. And the one thing, and I should have updated these slides, but the other thing I've also added since then is an ID. Because we do put ID numbers on all these, and I've found it's actually a lot easier if I put an ID number on the document itself. But so those are the kind of things you'll see in that metadata. Next is the context and problem, right? And again, here you're going to describe the situation or the problem that led to you needing to make a decision. Use a couple sentences, a paragraph. I wouldn't go too far, because this whole document should be readable within a couple minutes, right? And I also am a big believer that this document should be readable by everyone involved, which includes your business stakeholders. Now, grant you, there's going to be some parts that are just not going to understand, so I could tell you right now, my business stakeholders, the one I was working on yesterday, they're going to have no clue what I'm talking about when I say that I need hosted agents and I'm going to need these licenses and all that type of stuff. But we're still going to write it in a way so that at least it's not too complex, but also gives you that great idea. The next area, and sure enough, actually on my template, I even say this is optional to include, but is the decision drivers. So as we were making a decision, what were some of those drivers that we needed to make the decision? These drivers could be things like financial reasons. Well, we need to make sure that we have something that's not going to cost us an arm and a leg. It could be technical reasons, right? Well, we're a .NET shop, so we probably need to stick within .NET if we can. Lots of different reasons why you could do this and need to do that. And so you would document that here. And then next, you will come up to the considered options. Hopefully, you're not just thinking about one option. I will say sometimes it is, right? At least you just need the document. You didn't really consider anything else. Although generally, and I've seen this, and when I'm doing my reviews of these, I usually say, well, come on, you had to have something else, all right? So definitely think about those options. What were you considering? What other options were you thinking about? So I'll go back to the one I was working on yesterday. There were two main options. Right? The options were, because again, it's not obvious, okay, we have to do self-hosted, right? But our option was, because we do have a big on-prem site, and Azure is actually new for the company. So we had an option. Do we host these self-hosted in Azure, or do we host them in our VM environment on-prem? But the other option was, and this is basically the stupid option, we could turn off the security while we're doing these tests and then turn them back on, right? Now, that's a non-starter, right? I mean, we're definitely not going to do that option. But I wrote it down, and I included it in there because I wanted to make sure anyone who reads this later on knows that I at least thought about it. And here's the reason, and later on, I describe why we said not to do this, other than the obvious, that just doesn't make sense. Why am I going to open, if I must spend all this time to get my, my apps tied down securely, why I'm going to open up even for 10 minutes a day. So then the big section, and the one that really matters, is that decision outcome. Here we're defining what are we going to be putting in here. What did we decide on? And we'll generally write a simple statement. We decided to do this because of X and Y. All right. And then you'll notice I list the consequences again, good and bad. Because every decision has bad parts. The bad might not be that bad, but definitely we want to make sure we point them out. More than anything else, it's making sure we thought about all the different things. And then we want to make sure that we talk about implementation. And I will say, these next couple of sections, these get to be a little bit iffy as what you'll have, right? So implementation, what do we need to do to implement this, right? So again, going back to the one I was working on yesterday, once we make a decision, we have not made a decision. But in the implementation, I'll talk about, okay, well, we're going to need to, stand up the VM in Azure, or we're going to need to stand up the new instance in VMware. We're going to need to acquire these licenses. We're going to need to, so on and so on and so on. So we list that out. So again, it's right there. And again, we have one place to go to this. I will say, if your implementation gets really complicated, I would say have a very simple, bit in here, and then write into another document. Right? If it's going to be pages of implementation, I would put it in another document. And then we have that confirmation, how we can confirm that the decision we made was the right decision and that we did we fell through and we actually did what we said we were going to do. Again, this should be simplistic, but it should be describe what we need. And then finally, I really do like listing the stakeholders. Who's actually involved in this? Whether they're involved in the decision or they're involved in the outcome. So again, a lot of times my business owner or my product owner is not involved in the decision, but they are a stakeholder because it's important to them. And again, like I say, so I have 3 different development teams, and so we can be making decisions that might impact multiple development teams, and so we want to make sure we list those different dev teams and those different product owners. And then the next section we'll have are our pros and cons of the options. So again, however number of options you decided on, talk about those pros and cons. And again, more than anything else is transparency. It's letting people know, what did you think about? What did you not think about? This is really helpful. I'll tell you one great example where this could be helpful. So we are a Microsoft shop. We're using Aspire. Well, one of the fun parts about using Aspire is, it's not technically preview, but in reality it's preview, right? Because Microsoft is in active development of Aspire, right? 9.2 just broke a couple things for us, right? And so it's really in there. So I bring this up because I might make a decision. Hey, we're going to use Aspire. Well, 2 years from now, that might not have been the right decision, right? But at least here we can talk about why what were our pros and cons we saw in that. And that's why we want to do this kind of stuff. We'll generally have a more information. I will say 90% of the time what I see in here, there are no more information, right? And that's fine. Because again, at least I took the time to think about that, all right? We'll have follow-on information. Generally, I usually tie this more to like the business side. What does the business need to follow on to make sure, especially again, I will say at our company, while they have never done integration tests, they have done lots of end-to-end testing. They're very accustomed to doing end-to-end testing. And the business gets sometimes involved in too much with testing. So, what do you need to look for in these types of things? And then finally, the record history, right? So we know dates, right? Get an idea of this. If or anything else, so I can then go look, okay, well, what are my records when I made these type of things? Because again, that could, especially in IT, that can be really, really important, right? Because I might have made a decision, today, and 3 months from now, especially like if you're doing AI, 3 months is 20 years in AI right now. I use a prime example. So you see all my images I've used so far, they were all AI generated yesterday and the day before. And, just a couple of months ago, I was generating some images in AI, and, it came up text, and the text was horrible. And so 2 days ago when I was creating these new images, and it added text I didn't add in, I'm like, oh, no, I gotta go back and tell it, remove the text. Look, no, the text is actually right. But I bring this up because things can change so fast. So having those dates is really, really important. So like I say, overall, this is the template that we have used, Jasper has used. This has worked well for us. It is a little bit heavy, and sure enough, you can go and search for ADR templates. You'll find plenty. There are some that are very short. And, as you're starting down your road of ADRs, I would look for the short ones first, before you try to do a really long one like this one. Because, again, if you're new to ADRs, and not just you, but your company is new to them, you get more resistance if you try to do it, just like this. I mean, this is the template that I started with our company, and I had some resistance. The benefit I had was, we were working with a consulting company who also, was using ADR, so they were like, oh yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then just my experience has weighed well with the company, so they were willing to listen to that. But now that we've seen the parts that make up the ADRs, the important part is writing clear ADRs. Again, especially with technical decisions, these can be really hard to understand, even for other technical users, nevertheless, when I want to try to write them. But the big thing is we want to make sure, especially like that decisions in the problem statement, that they're concise, but they're comprehensive, all right? We want to make sure that we focus on the why and not just the what. The what is important, but the most important thing here is the why. And so we want to make sure we focus on that. We want to make sure that we address alternatives and the rejected options, right? Again, like I said, I wrote up the option of we could just turn off the security. And like I say, that's a silly option, but I want to make sure it was written up. I want to make sure it was documented, the why. Because here's what's going to happen. I can already tell you, I'm going to have a business owner who's going to say, or a product owner who's going to say, well, couldn't we just do this, right? I mean, it's only going to be for a couple minutes. It's like, yeah, it only takes a hacker a couple minutes to break my system, all right? Plus, on top of it, I mean, and I listed this, the work it would be required to go and write scripts and then maintain all those scripts would be a nightmare, all right? So you definitely want to make sure you write all those up. You want to keep the language simple and direct. Again, ADRs, their primary target is your dev teams, right, and your architecture teams, right? And then maybe, you know, your DevOps teams and those type of things. You know, but they are also, you want them to be readable by your team, you know, by your business side of things. At least to some extent, at least that they can get a general understanding of what you're trying to convey. So, all right, and I actually started talking about the vague versus, and I forgot, I had that section. So a vague decision statement versus a more, you know, a better one. So here we see, we chose the Black Widow covert communication system. All right, I'm clearly describing what we chose. But is that really a great decision statement? I mean, it just tells me, you know, it just tells me the what. It doesn't tell me the why. A better statement would be, we chose the Black Widow covert communication system because its advanced end-to-end encryption, real-time threat detection, and adaptive network performance provide our high-risk operations discrete, secure, responsive communications. Obviously, that's completely made up, but point being is I spent just another moment to write up a little bit more, and now that statement is so much more impactful. Just reading that one little thing, I probably don't need to read the rest of the document. I probably, you know, most people have exactly what I need out of that. Right, so that's definitely something we want to pick out of. All right, so war stories. And really what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk over, this isn't a real ADR, but it is a realistic ADR. You know, I probably have at least thought about this one. And you know, the example I'm going to have is like, you know, so we've got a startup company. You know, they don't have a whole lot of money, but they need, you know, they need a lot of capability, right? So what can they do? So we'll write up an ADR similar to this, all right? Adopting serverless architecture. So they analyzed it, they figured out what they needed to do, they wrote their decision, and they said, you know, as a tech startup, we must quickly build scalable web applications, and we need a way to handle this without, you know, we're a startup, we don't have a whole lot of money, all right? How can we do this? How can we have something that will scale out with us? And let it be known, I'm a big serverless fan, so you know, obviously, I wrote something with serverless. But we've got some of our decision drivers, right? You know, need for rapid development, you know, limited resources. And yes, this is, again, a serverless guy writing up an ADR. I know all the things, right? But, you know, we write up our considered options. Serverless architecture, traditional server-based, you know, containerized microservices. You know, some really good options. You know, especially, I will say, over the last, you know, like 2 years, you know, using things like Azure Container Apps, and I forgot what ADRs calls it, their service. But, you know, that containerized stuff gets even more interesting. But, yeah, getting back to the ADR, right? So then I've got my decision outcome. We wrote up the reason why we did this, you know, or what the decision was, but also the reasons why, right? You know, the fact that this will allow us to build rapid development. It'll allow us to grow, you know, our builds will grow as we grow type things. We've got our good and bad. I purposely left this really simple so it fits on the screen. Really should probably have some more goods and more bads. But at least we wrote up what we thought about, wrote up our implementation plan, you know, how we can, you know, figure out what we can start doing this. You know, what is our confirmation? And then finally, you know, our record. That's kind of an example of what we'll see. You know, so like I say, this is just a real simple example of an ADR. You know, there's a lot of different options that can come in here. But I want you to at least see, you know, a simple example because so it's a little bit more easier to comprehend right up front. Again, if you're more interested in this, definitely go to my repo that I've got the QR code at the end because I wrote up some more examples. To include, I will say there are actually 2 ADRs that are actual ADRs from Jasper. So I work for Jasper Engines and Transmissions. I actually took 2 ADRs that we wrote. I took out any Jasper information out of them, but so they're real. To include, we did an ADR to do ADRs. All right, a little bit meta, but so you'll see those kind of examples in there. So, but let's dissect this a little bit more, right? Because again, we saw what was in there, but so that decision. We had the decision of adopt a serverless architecture using Azure Functions. Now, really, we should have wrote a little bit more, but that was the decision. We figured out what we needed to adopt, and we thought about that. Again, this is precise. It's deciding exactly what we said, because we didn't just say we're going to do serverless architecture. We said we're going to do serverless architecture using Azure Functions, right? Again, if you favor AWS, you can do it using Lambda instead, right? Point being is we're defining what we wanted. We have a rationale that defines everything, in that context and so forth, right? We need to reduce the need for infrastructure management, right? We need to, Azure Functions provided automatic scaling, right? I mean, these are, helps us really define why did we pick serverless because it's cool, or did we pick serverless because it has some good reasons? And then, we've got that consequence. Need to move fast, need to stay competitive, right? I mean, this company apparently, they're in a fast-moving market. Again, as a startup, they probably have some competitors, right? There really is not any unique ideas. Everyone's probably thought of it, and so there's probably another competitor out there. But also, again, those consequences. And like I say, we see those positives, right? Faster time to market, reduce operational costs, improve scalability. Now, I will say, any serverless paper or talk, you'll have those are the great things. You should also think about this more on your side of it. What are the real benefits you see in this, right? But also, I've got those trade-offs. Even though we decided to do this, right? These are some of the trade-offs, right? Oh, we're going to have to, we got to learn some stuff. We've never done this before, right? That's a great trade-off to think about. The vendor lock-in. I mean, that's a typical issue with functions as a service, is that you now have vendor lock-in, right? You're now locked into Azure, or you're locked into AWS, or what have you, because the way how those technologies work, you're writing to those SDKs, right? So, even though I really want to push this, right? This is a decision I made, but we really should, even the ones that we don't want to talk about, we should put them in there. So some best practices, what I've learned over the time. Number one, write your ADRs early. Right? Definitely the moment you've actually made the decision, you should be writing it. But as I like starting them as I'm actually thinking about it. If there's anything else, it gives me a structured format, because like I say, we use a template and so forth. Right? Keep them short. Keep them focused on a single decision. And that single decision sounds easy, but can be hard. So again, I keep on going to that example, the one I'm working on right now. One of the decisions that kind of comes up with that is not just, okay, well, we're going to go to self-hosted. Do we switch all the existing pipelines to the self-hosted, or do we leave them on the Microsoft hosted? And at the moment, I will tell you, right at the moment, the ADR has both those decisions in there, but I already know that we will write that out. Because I'm using this as tracking, I've got them in one, but I plan on moving those out. They should be single-focused. Regular review and update your ADRs. Like I say, as time goes, ADRs they do age, and sometimes not very well. So you want to make sure you review them. I recommend, that you come up with a cadence, and you're going to say, for a project that's in active development, especially a project that's been in active development for a while, maybe on a quarterly basis, you want to review, the decisions that were made and look at those. Again, the timing will really depend on what you're doing. And then the big thing is involve the entire team. Again, don't do the whole ivory tower and make these decisions and say, here you go, right? Involve the entire team. And I'll tell you, especially the young ones on your team. That's one of the things we've actually found a lot of success with interns, so we've got a lot of interns and kids who have only graduated college over a year or two. I'll tell you what, I learned so much from them, and I get them involved in these decisions because they've got fresh ideas. So lots of great practices, lots of things you want to think about. But the other set I want to really talk about is the how do you preserve these decisions, right? Number one, I already mentioned this, but again, establish that regular review process. And it's going to depend, could even depend project by project. So at Jasper, we also have a lot of legacy development. Obviously, the decision I made today, it's probably going to be valid for quite a while because it's legacy software, right? So we definitely want to think about that. Make sure that you update ADRs when the decision changes, because things will, and what an update means could mean a couple of different things. It could mean actually update the document, or it could mean replace that document with a new one. If it's a drastic change, then you probably should write a whole new one and supersede it. Use statuses. Again, an ADR doesn't technically need to have a status. But I tell you what, you're going to want to know the difference between one that's still in draft and one that, we've decided and we're moving on this. Archive outdated ADRs. And again, I'm not saying delete them, but move them to a different place, right? Because again, so we remove that craft. And version control your ADRs. I mean, this sounds like a no-brainer, right? We version control everything else. We should version control these. I will say, so at Jasper, what we do is we have in each repo, for each different repo we have a decisions folder. And we actually put those documents in there so they're staying right with the project. And then we do a PR on those, right? So that they go through it so we can actually, get comments and so forth on them. So I've got version control. I can see when changes were made to this. So lots of good things for that. So finally, boy, I'll tell you what, I timed this talk really well. I was actually worried I was going to go over. But so your mission briefing, right? What do I want you to do next? Well, number one, commit to the ADR best practices. I wrote up some of the more important best practices. But definitely there's some other ones. You can definitely find some good examples. But look at them. Look at these practices before you even start. So you can see some other people's experiences. I mean, that's why you come to a talk like this, right? But begin your first ADR review cycle, right? Start writing them and start reviewing them. Ensure that you have team alignment on the ADRs. Make sure everyone agrees with them, and then be sure that you adopt, a tactical approach to them. All right. I mean, you don't have to do everything I just told you, because again, ADRs are really flexible. But make sure you are tactical with them. You are thinking them through. And then finally, own the mission and execute. All right. Make sure that you actually do something. That's probably the more important thing. But I think the big thing is, that you own this. You do what makes the most sense for you and your organization. So that, like I said, there's all my contact information. If you have any questions about ADRs, I do a lot of talking about serverless and event-driven, so those are my areas. The QR code will take you right to the repo. Look under Star Trek, and you'll find these slides. You'll find, like I say, the ADRs I showed here, along with some others. And then, and like I say, I hope you did find these useful. I hope you, use this to build out a better process at your own companies. So with that, I do have a minute. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Yep. So the question was, should you, basically, I didn't document them when I made a decision, but I made them recently. Should I document? And the answer is definitely yes, right? Because you want to do that before you have forgotten about it. So but again, it does come up to, there is the other big question of what you document, what you don't. Because again, the little tiny decisions, you're just going to be wasting time. But yes, I would definitely say that. All right, yes.
In the instance of superseded or outdated ADRs, is there a great way to track that? Because that's, I see the notes in there, but this is just text. Mm-hmm.
So the question is basically, paraphrase, what should you do with your older ones, and how should you figure out, what's out there and what you should do? I will say that is one of the hard parts about ADRs. There's really no good way. At least I haven't found a good tool to manage ADRs. Now, there are some tools to manage them. One of the biggest issues I have with most of the tools is they're focused on like a single set of ADRs. And like I said, what we have done is we've spread ours out. So I don't have a really good answer for you, to be honest with you. It's kind of, you just kind of have to maintain it a little bit. What we have done is we have them out in separate repos, but then I have an ADR repo where it's a catalog of all the ADRs. So at least I have one place I can go to and see my list. One of the things that I do have on my backlog that we want to work on, the good thing, I've already talked, we're going to make this open source, is I am looking at doing a system to kind of manage these, because again, with so many projects, that's been the hardest part we've had. But because like I said, I haven't been able to find a tool that does that well. Because one of the hard parts is searching for them, right? Because that's one of the hard parts. Although there are tools, you could put it like behind a search tool that would index everything. That might work also. Yes.
Do you have experience with software architecture decision records where you say, I use this language or this framework or this dependency because of X reason?
Okay. So the question was, do I have any experience with software decisions? Yeah. I mean, and really, we don't do anything different. Is really the answer, right? It's still a decision that gets made. I mean, yeah, the example I was using was, more of an infrastructure because I literally wrote that ADR yesterday, right? So it's really fresh in my head. Honestly, most of the ADRs I write is more software related, right? It is, because a lot of them is, again, especially in my job right now, my job is to take requirements and then decide on an architecture for the dev team to build, right? So the question is, where do I find, not being too specific and so forth? Honestly, I don't have a straight answer, right? Because it really does depend on each time. Because, and the good part, what I have found, because again, like I said, I introduced this to our company about a year ago, so it was new to everyone. And at first, people were a little bit hesitant. And what I now see is, as the dev teams pick up the things and start rolling with, architectures that my team has written, they're like, hey, because they're supposed to then take it on and expand upon it, right? And like, hey, I probably should write an ADR for this. I'm like, yeah, because someone's going to probably wonder why you made that decision, right? And it tries directly to your first part of the question, because they're actually building the software, and so they decided, hey, we wanted to use this or we want to use that, within the parameters you gave us. Yes, they keep it in their repo, and again, like I say, what we're doing is we have a center repo, and like I say, at least the very beginning when I'm gonna write, like I say, I'm gonna write something up, and is the whole, the hardest part we have is remembering. Okay, I put it in this repo, but I also got to put a pointer in our master repo, because I find a lot of those, and I got to. Yes, and like I said, I will say there are tools that work well if you're just doing one repo. There are some really nice tools. I've looked at those. I've actually looked at them because I wanted to say, hey, maybe I could fork that and make it, but like they're written in Go, and I don't do Go. So I've looked at the code. It all looks really well, but I'm not going to fork something. That's especially something I'm going to do on my own time. So, awesome. Well, thank you, everybody.